Okay, I know I said at the start of the last Smash Bros. Video that I was only going to do one Smash Bros. Video, but that video did really well, and I wanted to flesh out the predictions roster that was only one part of that larger video. Since making that first video, I've heard compelling arguments made for alternative character choices and cuts, and wanted to incorporate those into one final revised roster now that, as many other YouTubers have pointed out, the roster for the next Smash game is likely in the process of being devised if it hasn't been finalized already. Besides, the thing about junk food is that you don't just have it once. I promise after this video I won't make another Smash speculation video until the game is actually out to see how I did. I initially considered waiting until the game was revealed to make this follow-up video, but I have the motivation now, and I don't want my opinions to get swept up in changing speculation movements after the roster has supposedly been finalized. Before I get into my revised picks, I want to lay a few ground rules. First of all, this video assumes that the next Smash game will be a full sequel and not a port of Ultimate. I personally don't expect Ultimate to get a Switch 2 edition just because historically Smash games haven't ever gotten ported over to the immediate next console, but whether or not that remains the case, I think it's more fun for speculation's sake to assume that we're talking about a full new game. Secondly, the roster size we're working with is 65 characters, landing somewhere between Smash 4 and Ultimate's roster sizes. Of those 65 characters, 16 will be newcomers. Because this video is an addendum of sorts to the last one, I will not be going over every single cut character like I did the last time, only the character cuts I am substituting for different veteran choices. However, I do still want this video to be able to stand alone, so I will be discussing every one of my newcomer choices in detail, even the ones that are the same as in the last video. A popular request in the comments of the last video was to go over my thinking in terms of movesets for the newcomers, so I will be doing that here to provide a little bit more substance. With that out of the way, let's start with the newcomers. Like in the last video, I'll be going in order from who I believe to be the most to least likely. Starting with the obvious, a Gen 9 rep is basically a lock. Ever since Brawl, they have added the most popular Pokemon from the most recent game, and I see no reason why the next game would be any different. Initially, I was between Tinkaton and Meowscarada, but although Tinkaton is perhaps a smidge more popular among the fans, I, like others, have grown to lean towards Meowscarada for the sake of having a fully evolved grass starter in the game. It's not hard to imagine a moveset for Meowscarada. It has both physical and special grass-type moves to draw from. It could probably even steal some moves from Ivysaur, and it even has its own signature move, Flower Trick, which could act as its final smash. Next, we're also bound to get another Fire Emblem rep. It's possible it could be Kai from Fortune's Weave, but since that game isn't out yet, and I thus can't speak for Kai's moveset, let's go with Alear from Engage instead. Alear's smash attacks could be standard Swordy Fair, while their specials can draw on the emblems, that is, the returning Fire Emblem Pro tags in Engage. I'm sure I'm not the first person to suggest that, but I haven't actually finished Engage yet, so I won't go into too much more detail. Finally for the locks, Bandana Waddle Dee is a super popular request from the fans, and he recently appeared in Kirby Air Riders, so at this point he seems kind of like a no-brainer. He fights with a spear, so that'll probably be the crux of his moveset. Maybe since he's based on a regular Kirby enemy, he could draw attacks from or otherwise summon basic Kirby enemies for his specials if they wanted to get fancy. Now into characters that aren't locks but still are incredibly likely, a new Xenoblade rep from Xenoblade 3 is a probable inclusion for the next game. Most people would probably volunteer Noah for this slot, but I'm going to go with Mio instead, because her range-based twin rings would make for a more unique moveset than Noah's sword. With Pyra and Mithra, Smash has shown it isn't averse to selecting the deuteragonist rather than the protagonist from Xenoblade games anyway. Mio is an evasion tank in Xenoblade 3, so it isn't hard to imagine that playstyle-wise, she'd be something of a speedy zoner-type character. Since she uses rings, maybe she can even draw from Min Min's moveset a bit. I'm sure that's what you all wanted to hear, right? Another character like Min Min. Like Bandana Waddle Dee, another very popular first-party character request is Waluigi. I think he's a little less likely than the locks, but only just so. A common suggestion for Waluigi's moveset is to base him on the Mario sports games, since that's where he comes from. But I'm a big advocate of revamping Daisy into her own character, and I think she probably would end up doing something similar. In general, revamping movesets of characters that have been around for a while seems to be a popular request among the fans for the next game. Here are the characters that have had recent appearances that might warrant a new moveset, in my opinion. I don't know how likely that is, but it would certainly be fitting considering how many major Nintendo characters have received design overhauls recently. Editors note, while I was writing this video, they announced a new Star Fox game. In the last video, I cut both Wolf and Falco. I considered adding Falco back here, but I think it would be easier if they just revamped Fox and updated his design and moveset to match. Anyway, back to Waluigi. Maybe they could take the random punch moves from Mario and give them to Waluigi instead. They have a few options. To once again mention the two predictions I stole from a talking sock, Pauline has become a recurring Mario character in the Switch era and would fit right in with Peach, Daisy, and Rosalina if added. The difference is, she would actually be added as a Donkey Kong character, and would probably draw on both her appearances in Odyssey and Bonanza for her moveset. Many of her attacks would probably be based on her singing, her vocals made manifest as projectiles. Gaps in her moveset can then be filled in with references to the Mario spin-offs that she appears in, much like with Peach and Daisy. Then, Ring Fit Trainee appears essentially as a replacement for Wii Fit Trainer. Ring Fit Adventure sold super well, so it isn't much of a stretch to imagine the trainee would be added. I haven't played Ring Fit Adventure, but presumably the Ring Con would feature heavily in the trainee's moveset, alongside generic exercise-based attacks, perhaps in fact drawn directly from Wii Fit Trainer but reskinned to match Ring Fit's aesthetic. Zelda and Pikmin are two franchises that are overdue for a new rep considering how important they are as franchises to Nintendo. For the Zelda character, there was a Smash roster predictions video I watched featuring John Cartwright that made a compelling case for Rauru as the new Zelda character, being a character that simultaneously represents modern and classic Zelda due to the shifting nature of his appearances throughout the series, although, funnily enough, in that video, Rauru didn't actually make it onto their final roster. Presumably, Rauru would draw on the special abilities granted to Link through the Sheikah Slate in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom in order to best represent those two games in Smash. As for Pikmin, I was initially opposed to including Ochi as the new rep due to his quadrupedal status, but I suppose if Duck Hunt can do it, so can Ochi. To be honest, I really don't know what happens in Pikmin 4, but I'm assuming that at the very least, Ochi can charge into things and hit them with his tail. Since most of the other viable character options for Pikmin would be other captains that would play similarly to Olimar, Ochi would at least provide some more variety. Metroid has not been missing new reps in the same way as Pikmin and Zelda, Ridley having just been added in the last game, but with Metroid's return to activity in the Switch era, adding another Metroid character, one that has been prominent in the Switch era, seems like an appropriate commemoration. Ravenbeak and Sylex are the two characters most often suggested to fill this role, and between the two my vote goes to Sylex, as they have already said that they plan to continue Metroid Prime 4 into a second Metroid Prime trilogy, and as such, Sylex will continue to be relevant going forward. The extent of my experience with the Metroid series is 15 minutes of Super Metroid and 2 hours with Samus Returns, so I truly have no idea what Sylex does, but like Samus, he does appear to have an arm cannon, so surely it can't be too difficult to concoct a moveset for him. Finally, to wrap up the first party picks, I would offer the Chorus Kids from Rhythm Heaven and Ayumi Tachibana from Famicom Detective Club. As I mentioned in my last video, the Chorus Kids were previously cut from Smash 4, and Rhythm Heaven is probably the biggest Nintendo franchise not to be represented with a character in Smash. With Groove nearly out now, the series has a new grasp at relevancy that it can use for a Smash inclusion. In terms of a moveset for the Chorus Kids, a fighting style may not be immediately obvious based on their design, but I think I agree with the general consensus that a Rhythm Heaven character would draw from multiple minigames throughout the series in order to compose a moveset. As for Yumi, she was previously considered for Melee but cut due to her relative obscurity among Western audiences. Now, however, circumstances have changed, as her games were recently remade, and her series even got a new third entry after decades of inactivity. It is true that she doesn't do much in the way of combat in her home game, but I figure she can probably take the route Phoenix Wright did in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and use relevant objects from her game as projectiles. She would also slot in nicely as this game's retro rep. That's all for the first party characters, but we still have 4 third party characters to discuss. A new Sonic character was a common request throughout Ultimate's lifespan, what with the whole hero versus villains theme. And the year of Shadow having just passed, Shadow seems like an appropriate addition to the cast. He could be modeled after Sonic physically, perhaps saving the modeling team a bit of work, while incorporating chaos control to make him mechanically distinct. It would also be really funny if they gave him a gun, but I'm not expecting them to do that. Next, for a character that would surprise people, but I actually think is quite likely, we have Sans from Undertale. Toby Fox has worked closely with Nintendo in recent years and has met Sakurai personally, so it wouldn't be hard to imagine them brokering a deal. I've seen some mention that Chris would be a better choice because they have more moveset potential, but Sans is more iconic, and I think he still has enough in terms of attack options to build a moveset out of. I mean, he has a whole boss fight to draw from. Sure, most of those attacks are bones of different sizes, but they made Sonic's whole moveset the spin dash, and Sonic had multiple move options, so they're certainly not opposed to creating a repetitive moveset. For our third party character, we're adding a new Microsoft rep. Microsoft was happy to play ball when adding Banjo and Steve to Ultimate, and as I mentioned in my last video, I would go as far as to say that Microsoft probably wants the marketing bump that Smash Bros. Would provide them, especially considering the current state of Xbox. Crash and Doomguy are common choices for a new Microsoft rep, but I think Microsoft will want to go with their mascot Master Chief. Moveset is pretty self-explanatory, he has a lot of guns, he'll use guns. I don't know, I don't play Halo. I think this particular character reveal would have huge shock value, and it'll be really fun to see the tonal clash between Master Chief and the Nintendo mascot characters. And for the final newcomer in our roster, we have the most notorious pre-Ultimate character request not to be added to Ultimate, Geno. This one is the most shaky considering Square's general weirdness when it comes to licensing their characters for Smash, but I think they would want to add him just to close out that chapter of Smash history. Geno obviously has his gun hand, but he could also use various magic attacks drawn from Super Mario RPG. Maybe he could even include references to Paper Mario and Luigi. Although Geno is owned by a third party, he is still a Mario character, so the sky's the limit in terms of how he can call back to the overall Mario series. And so we have a revised list of newcomers. Just for fun, here's how it compares to the lists in my last video. Reading through this script, I realized I said a lot that I haven't played the games that these characters are from, but this is kind of my way of trying to create a balanced roster, not just me flooding the roster with choices of characters I want to see. That's one of the other rosters you're seeing on screen right now. So apologies for some of my ignorance in terms of movesets, but I'm hoping that the overall variety of character selection kind of makes up for it here. Now we're going to move on to the veteran fighters. Here are all of the veterans I cut in the last video to get the roster size down to 65 with the 16 newcomers added. If you'd like to know why I cut some of these characters, you can go back and watch that last video, although I'm about to correct some of my explanations here. Of these cut veterans, I will be reinstating 6, Robin, Lucario, Ike, and the 3 Mii fighters. Robin is just a swap here. I originally said that I would keep Chrom in the last video and have him promoted to a fully unique fighter, but I forgot the reason Chrom was cut from Smash 4 in the first place is because Robin was more interesting moveset-wise, so unfortunately Chrom will be getting the axe once more. Also in the last video, I mistakenly said that Lucario was a clone of Mewtwo, which was completely wrong. I have no idea where I got that from. Some of the comments then made a compelling case that Lucario was still more relevant than I gave them credit for, considering that they returned with their Mega and Legend ZA, and is generally still one of the more popular Gen 4 Pokemon, so back on the roster they go. Ike is not another Marth clone like many of the other Fire Emblem characters on the roster, and he is still incredibly popular within the fandom even though his games are a bit old at this point, so he's worth keeping in for the gameplay variety and character notoriety. Finally, the Mii fighters, although complicating development somewhat due to their customizable nature, allow Nintendo to charge for DLC Mii costumes, and allow the Miis to continue their wave of revitalized relevancy following the release of Tomodachi Life Living the Dream. Unfortunately, having added back these characters, we are now over our 65 character limit, so who are we cutting to make room for? I've already mentioned how we're cutting Chrom for Robin, but that still leaves 5 cuts to make. In my last video, I opted not to cut Ice Climber, Squirtle, and Ivysaur, even though I cut all the other previously cut fighters, because they were only excluded from Smash 4 due to technical limitations. However, in retrospect, that wasn't really fair. Arguably, all previously cut characters were cut due to constraints with either time or technology, rather than issues with the characters themselves, so to be even-handed, we can cut these 3 too, leaving Charizard alone on the roster like he was in Smash 4. On the subject of Pokemon, while Incineroar continues to ravage Pokemon's competitive scene, I'm not sure he's managed to maintain the same level of iconicity among the general public like the other Pokemon on this roster still have, so they're getting cut too, leaving Charizard as the only fire starter on the roster to complete the starter type trio. Only one more cut to make, and unfortunately, I think this last one is going to have to be Mr. Game & Watch. I hesitated to cut him in the last video because he's so iconic to Smash and Nintendo's history, but ultimately, most of the retro reps in Smash end up feeling like joke characters anyway. Much like how it didn't make sense to keep only some of the previously cut fighters, it didn't make much sense to cut Duck Hunt and Rob as retro reps, but keep Mr. Game & Watch. Don't worry though, we'll still have Ayumi as a retro rep on the roster, since Sakurai likes those. And thus, we have our final roster. I would just like to close this video out by defending one controversial cut I made in my last video, Diddy Kong. My point with cutting Diddy Kong was that to get the roster down to a manageable size, it was inevitable that some iconic first-party character was going to have to be cut. Even if you wanted to keep Diddy Kong, you'd probably have to cut someone else of equal status. People would be disappointed with any roster this reduced. Anyways, I keep yammering on about that last video. Even though I think this roster is probably more reflective of what we'll get now that I've had more time to sit on it, that previous video also has a lot of gag rosters that I think are funny, so feel free to watch that if that sounds interesting. On screen, you'll see an updated version of my wishlist roster from the end of that video. I tend to have a habit of disguising video topics as other videos. This one didn't do it, but that last Smash video did. Hopefully that nugget of intrigue entices you. But that's enough plugging for me. Until then.